Hello everyone, good afternoon. I am Roxanne Lila Pasaran and I will be reporting about quasi-experimental designs. However, let us first discuss kung unsa man gyud ning quasi-experimental research before we move on to the different quasi-experimental designs. So, quasi-experimental research is similar to experimental research in that there is manipulation of an independent variable. It differs from experimental research because either there is no control group, no random selection, no random assignment, and or no active manipulation. Quasi-experimental designs address the need to study the effect of an independent variable in settings in which the control features of true experimental designs cannot be achieved. So, ang quasi-experimental design kay same na gyapon ni siya sa true experiment kung asa nagyapon tay independent and dependent variable. Tapos, ang ginaistudihan gyapon niya is ang cause and effect relationship between aning independent and the dependent variable. So, ang kalahian lang ani kay ang kaning quasi-experimental research kay dili ni siya ga-rely sa random selection or random assignment sa participants niya. Pwede pod nga wala ni siya control group. Another is that sa quasi-experimental design, the researcher often does not have the control over the treatment, unlike sa true experimental design kung asa ang researchers mismo ang nagadesign sa ilahang kaugalingon na treatment and then naadjud sila control atong treatment kay ilahang ihatag sa ilahang participants. So let's say for example nagconduct ka og research about a new treatment which may help people who suffer from depression. So kung sa true experimental design ka sa imuhang participants, diba, i-divide mo siya into two. Na kay control group and then na kay experimental group, you randomly assign the participants kung asa sila na group mabutang. And then kitong imuhang mga participants kay ibutang nimo sila sa mental health clinic para maka-receive sa treatment sa imuhang experimental group kay moto sila ang makadawat sa new treatment while ang imuhang control group moto sila ang makadawat sa mga standard course of treatment for depression. Pero ibutang nato nga tungod sa ethical reasons, tungod sa ethics and rules and regulations nga gina-follow sa mental health clinic, wala ni sugot ang directors or kanang mga heads ato nga mental health clinic nga i-randomly assign lang nimo ang mga patients sa kung unsa nga treatment ilahang madawat. Therefore, dili na mahimong true experimental design ang imuhang research. Kung ani ang mahitabo, pwede ka mag-move. You can use quasi-experimental design. So, let's say sa quasi-experimental design, nahibal-an nimo nga katong nga clinic na ay mga psychotherapist nga nag-try sila atong bag-o nga treatment while ang uban yung mga psychotherapist kay ginagamit nila tong standard course of treatment for depression. So kay na may situation nga ing ani, pwede ra nimo istudihan tong pre-existing groups nga katong mga patients nga nakadawat sa bag-o nga therapy versus sa katong mga patients na nakadawat atong standard course of treatment. So natay unom ka types of quasi-experimental design and we will be tackling each of this design. So first we have the one group post-test only design. This one group post-test only design, called a one-shot case study by Campbell and Stanley, lacks a crucial element of a true experiment, which is a control or comparison group. It has a serious deficiencies in the context of designing an internally valid experiment that will allow us to draw causal inferences about the effect of an independent variable on a dependent variable. So, ang kaning one group post-test only design is characterized or specially characterized by having no control group and no measurements before the intervention. Maybe mao ni ang simplest and weakest nga quasi-experimental designs in terms of level of evidence. This is because wala man kay measurement kay gikuha before ka nag-intervene, tapos wala po kay control group kung asa nimo pwede i-compare ang imuhang data nga nakuha. So kani nga design kay dako jud og kulang which regards sa iyang internal validity. So tungod kay ing-ani man ang data na imuhang na-gather kay ma-compare lang ti siya sa kung unsa inyuhang gi-assume nga mahitabo kung wala na implementong intervention. So maoning we may have an implicit idea of how a control group would perform. So for example, suppose you want to investigate whether sitting close to a stranger will cause the stranger to move away. You might try sitting next to a number of strangers and measure the number of seconds that elapse before they leave. Now, suppose that the average amount of time before the people leave is 9.6 seconds. Unfortunately, this finding is not interpretable kay again there is no control group and then wala ka nag-take og measurement before ang intervention. You do not know whether they would have stayed longer if you had not sat down or whether they have stayed for 9.6 seconds anyway. It is even possible that they would have left sooner if you had not sat down. So mo to siyang example sa one group post-test only design. So for number 2, we have the one group pre-test post-test design. One way to obtain a comparison is to measure participants before the manipulation, muning gitawag nga pre-test, and again afterward, which is called the post-test. An index of change from the pre-test to the post-test can then be computed. So unlike sa una nga quasi-experimental design, which is the one group post-test only design, kaning one group pre-test post-test design kinahanglan gid siya legit nga comparison. However, dili ni between sa control group ug experimental group. This is done through a pre-test and a post-test. So ang data na imuhang mag-gather before kay dito ani mo i-compare ang data na imuhang mag-gather after sa intervention. Although mas improved than one group pre-test post-test design, this design has failed to take into account several alternative explanations. So the alternative explanations are history, maturation, testing, instrument decay, and regression toward the mean. So first we have history. History refers to any event that occurs between the first and second measurements, but is not part of the manipulation. History effects can be caused by virtually any confounding variable that occurs at the same time as the experimental manipulation. So let's suppose that you wanted to test the hypothesis that a relaxation training program will result in a reduction in cigarette smoking. So, iingon na to nga nag-gather ka og participants nga atong mga smokers, and then imo silang gitest sa tapos mo tong pre-test, nagkandak og pre-test sa ilaha, and then dito ana nimo gi insert ang training program, and then after silang training program nagkandak na pud ka og test mo to ang post-test. However, kung i-apply na to ang alternative explanation nga history, let's say for example nga, after nimo na-conduct ang pre-test, tapos during sa pag-apply nimo sa relaxation training kay naay nigawas nga balita nga naay famous person nga namatay tungod sa lung cancer because of smoking, and then wala pa nimo na-conduct ang imong post-test, makaapekto ni siya sa internal validity sa imong study kay pwede mahimong ang katong pagkamatay sa celebrity ang possible reason nga night effect nga nahitabo na katong pagkandak na nimo sa imong post-test. In addition, the longer the time lapse is between the pre-test and the post-test, the higher the risk is for history to bias the study. Maturation is any changes that occur systematically over time are called maturation effects. So, balik sa ito ang example, we know that people change over time, and then what if katong mga participants mong nakuha katong mga smoker kay over time magka-concern na sila about sa ilahang health. Now, let's say taas ang time lapse sa imuhang pagkuha sa imong pre-test ug sa imong post-test. So kung sa una tuluyok og utok tong imong mga participants na nakuha nga smoker tapos mokalita og katul-id ang ilahang utok nya makaingon sila nga hala delikado jud ay nga misigira ko panigarilyo nga mao na nga naay changes na nahitabo silang behavior tapos dugay pa jud ka nakakandak sa imong post-test naay possibility nga dili jud ang imong treatment nga gi-apply ang naka-change sa ilahang behavior but the maturation. Testing. Testing becomes a problem if simply taking the pre-test changes the participant's behavior. The problem of testing effects. In short, kaning testing effect mao ni siya ang impluwensya sa imong pre-test mismo sa outcome sa imong post-test. Now back to our example about the smoking and the relaxation treatment. For example, katong pre-test na imong gi-conduct kay nag-require nga isulat sa katong mga smoker sa diary or kanang ilang itali bitaw kung kapila sila manigarilyo sa isa ka daw, like okay manigarilyo ko ron itali na ko ana ba. So naay possibility nga kani imong pre-test na gihimo kay makaapekto ni siya sa behavior sa imuhang participants and then makabantay sila nga okay so yung ani day ang study nga maybe consciously or unconsciously nga ang imong participants kay ano mo na pud nila og reduce ang ilahang pagpanigarilyo. So instead nga moingon ka nga ang imong treatment nga gi-apply ang naay effect sa imong sa behavior sa imong participants, makaligtaan nimo na maybe ang imong daing pre-test ang naano ay epekto sa behavior sa imong participants. So mao ni ang testing. Next, we have instrument decay. Sometimes the basic characteristic of the measuring instrument change over time. This is called instrument decay. So, naman dyan mga studies kung asa ang measuring instrument kay ang researchers mismo kung asa sila mismo ang record sa outcome. Over time, an observer may gain skill, become fatigued, or change the standards on which observations are based. So, pwede po na siya mahimong factor sa pag-change sa results sa imuhang pre-test versus post-test. Now, balik ato tong example. Ibutang na to nga kung sa sinugdanan ang mga participants nimo kay motivated pa sila nga i-record or itali to nila ang ilahang number of cigarettes nga ginasigarilyo kada adlaw during sa pre-test kay interesado pa man sila tapos murag nabaguhan pa sila sa imong research pero by the time nga hapit ang post-test or pang post-test na kay kanang gitapulan na sila or gikapoy na sila nga mag-record or magtali sa ilang sigarilyo so naa change na mahitabo between sa pre-test and post-test. Pero instead ng imong treatment ang naka-change ato naay dako nga possibility nga instrument decay ang alternative explanation. Lastly, we have the regression toward the mean, or sometimes called statistical regression. Regression toward the mean is likely to occur whenever participants are selected because they score extremely high or low on some variable. Let's say, for example, katoto ang example about na po datong sigarilyo. So, during sa results sa pre-test, nakita nila nga daig kayo ang ilahang score ing ana. So, na-siya possibility nga kung i-retest ni muna sila, i-change nila ilahang answer para mas mapaduol sa mean ang results sa ilahang answers. So, for example, katong pagpili nimo sa imuhang participants kay ang imuhang gipili nga i-appeal sa relaxation training program kay katong mga heavily smokers jud, extremely heavy smokers. After nimo pag-administer sa imuhang treatment, na-siya possibility nga score. So, tungkol kay taas kay ilang score sa una, nag-change sila ang answers mo to na nibaba ang ilang score. So, naturally, kung i-compare nimo ang pre-test o post-test, di makita dyan nimo nga na-effect sa post-test. Pero, wala nimo na take into consideration ang alternative explanation nga regression toward the mean. So, for number 3, we have non-equivalent control group design. The non-equivalent control group design employs a separate control group, but the participants in the two conditions, the experimental group and the control group, are not equivalent. This problem, called selection differences or selection bias, usually occurs when participants who form the two groups in the experiment are chosen from existing natural groups. So, for example, katong gihapong training program o katong mga smokers, ang participants sa first group ay gitagaan og smoking frequency measure after nila nahuman ang training program, katong relaxation training program. Ang mga tao sa second group kay wala sila nag-participate sa bisag unsa nga program. So, let's say nga ang katong research kay nahitabot to siya or nakonduct to siya sa division sa usa ka dako nga kumpanya. Tanan nga employees nga manigarilyuhay kay ilahang gi-identify unya gi-recruit kay para mo ang mag-participate sa training program. Ang katong mga tao nga nag-volunteer para sa program kay gibutang na sila sa experimental group, unya katong mga tao nga simple mga smokers lang kay moto sila ang gibutang sa control group unya wala sila gipa-sign up para sa training. So mag-arise ang problema nga selection differences kay naay mga smokers nga nag-participate kay naay important differences kaysa atong mga tao nga wala nag-participate. Next, we have number 4, non-equivalent control group pre-test, post-test design. This is one of the most useful quasi-experimental designs. It is not a true experimental design because assignment to groups is not random. The two groups may not be equivalent. However, we have the advantage of knowing the pre-test scores. We can look at changes in scores from the pre-test to the post-test. If the independent variable has an effect, the experimental group should show a greater change than the control group. So, for example, students in one school are given a pre-test on their attitudes toward drugs, then are exposed to an anti-drug program, and finally are given a post-test. Students in a similar school are given a pre-test, not exposed to an anti-drug program, and finally are given a post-test. If students in the treatment condition become more negative toward drugs, this change in attitude could be an effect of the treatment. If it really is an effect of the treatment, then students in the treatment condition should become more negative than students in the control condition. For number 5, we have propensity score matching of non-equivalent treatment and control groups. Instead of matching on just one variable, the researcher can obtain measures of other variables thought to be important when comparing the groups. The scores on these variables are combined to produce what is called a propensity score. Individuals in the treatment and control groups can then be matched on propensity scores. This process is called the propensity score matching. So, ang kaning propensity score kay mao ni ang probability ang usa ka tawo kay mabutang siya sa treatment group base sa iyahang specific nga characteristics kung i-base pod siya sa purpose sa imong research. So lastly, we have interrupted time series design and control series design, a quasi-experimental design in which the effects of an intervention are evaluated by comparing outcome measures obtained at several time intervals before and several time intervals after the intervention was introduced. An interrupted time series design uses a categorical predictor, the absence or presence of an intervention. And so, for example, a manufacturing company might measure its workers' productivity for each week for a year. In an interrupted time series design, a time series like this one is interrupted by a treatment. The treatment was the reduction of the work shifts in a factory from 10 hours to 8 hours. Because productivity increased rather quickly after the shortening of the work shifts, and because it remained elevated for many months afterward, the researcher concluded that the shortening of the shifts caused the increase in productivity. So, as you have noticed, ang interrupted time series design and control series design kay naagyapan siya pre-test o post-test, pero ang kalahian lang niya kay there are multiple pre-tests taken before the intervention and there are also multiple post-tests taken after the intervention. One way to improve the interrupted time series design is to find some kind of control group. So, muna siya ang ginatawag nga control series design. Now we have reached the end of my report. I would like to thank you for listening, and without further ado, let's move on to the last reporter. Thank you.